episode 12 of the Woke-ish podcast. This is Ebony.
And this is Zelma.
And this week we will be talking about the W word, whiteness. But before we get there, we will start out with our shout-out segment.
Yes. So it's, if you've been on the internet or on social media, it's been a rough week for a lot of people. Some things we're gonna get into in this episode. But before we get to the sadder and more depressing things, I wanted to shout out Gina Rodriguez. So if you don't know her, she is the star of Jane the Virgin, which is a sitcom on the CW. She is Latina, and I wanted to shout her out because every year they nominate people for the Emmy Award, which is an award based on your acting for television, and they give people who are nominated some money to be able to kind of like promote themselves in order to encourage people to vote for them. And so Gina Rodriguez was nominated this year for Jane the Virgin, and instead of using that money to form her campaign to get people to kind of vote for her, she used it instead to pay for an undocumented Latina student's Princeton tuition for 4 years. And so Rodriguez convinced the CW, which is the organization that was going to give her the money, to put the chunk of spending towards this college scholarship. So I wanted to shout that out because I think that it was, there was like no shade like at all, but they were just saying that, she's nominated a lot and doesn't win. Mm-hmm. And so that she kind of like, this could have been her thinking like it might be better. My chances are not going to be, she's competing against a lot of people. And so that she was thinking like, instead of using this money for something that may not end with me getting a win, then I'll use this money for something that I know will actually happen. And so to use that for something that is going to impact someone's life, and not just someone's life, but like someone, one, who got into an Ivy League school, and right, two, who is undocumented. And so if you don't know, if you're undocumented, you pay out-of-state tuition, and so or you pay as an international student. And so she'd have to not only pay the very expensive tuition cost for an Ivy League school, which, if you don't know, is a lot higher than most universities, but she'd have to pay even more than any other student would have to pay because she'd be considered an international student. And so just wanted to shout out Gina Rodriguez for helping make young Latina students' dreams to get a 4-year education true, and hopefully it inspires other people to kind of give back in a similar way and use money that would otherwise be spent on like commercials and just kind of self-propaganda for your own benefit to help someone else. So shout out to Gina Rodriguez. Much needed good news in the Latino community given what's been happening among the immigrant community. And so just really excited that I was able to highlight something positive.
Yeah, and I was trying to find the name of the person that she's sending, but I haven't been able to find her names. But shout out to her as well, because getting into Princeton is nothing to sneeze at.
They probably don't want to send it, one, because she's undocumented, and two, because people are haters on the internet, and I'm sure that they will not send her positive and well wishes. But yes, you're right. Shout out to that undocumented Latina student for getting into one of the, hardest schools to get into.
Yeah.
So.
Okay, so now we will transition into our In the Know segment. Actually, before we do that, so like Zelma was saying initially, like this week has been full of like just sad news and drama. And so we were having a hard time finding shout outs, but we really want to shout out again, like to reemphasize that Woke-ish is a community, and we want to be able to shout out also people that listen and, their friends or family or whomever. And so if you have someone that's doing great things and you want us to shout them out, or you have someone that like, I don't know, has an online store or something.
Yeah.
And you want people to support them. This would be we ain't like famous, but we might be able to get some traffic to their site. So let us know if you have any shout outs. DM us, email us, whatever.
Yes.
Okay, so now we will transition to our In the Know segment. Okay, so now we will transition into everything depressing that there is to discuss about the atrocities of our country.
Yes.
So stay tuned for the In the Know segment.
Yes. This week's topic is on whiteness, and so we're going to have an interview with a guest where she's going to talk about just her research on whiteness and what she thinks it is. But before we get into that, just kind of these events that we talk about happened this week, but also I think kind of highlight what the negative effects of whiteness and what can happen when people of color are viewed as threatening, as unimportant, as not valuable. And so the first terrible thing we're going to talk about is the family separation policy. And if you've been listening to the news, reading newspapers, if people do that still, or on social media, you've kind of been seeing videos and pictures of children being separated from their families. And so this is all part of Trump's zero tolerance policy. And however, on Wednesday, he signed an executive order to undo the damage that he did. But what the family separation policy did was, since early May, 2,342 children have been separated from their parents after crossing the southern U.S. border, according to the Department of Homeland Security, as part of the new immigration strategy by the Trump administration. And there's been conflicting statements about whether it was intentional, this policy was intentionally made to deter immigrants from coming to the United States, or whether it was this is just a temporary or indefinite solution to children being with their parents. And so usually they didn't separate children from their families if they were detained. But starting in early May, Attorney General Jeff Sessions, quoting the Bible, said that this policy was going to enable the United States government to physically separate children, including babies and including infants and adolescents, from their families, from their parents. And so because children can't be detained with their parents. So their solution was just to put children in tender age centers, and because there wasn't enough space for some of these children, they started actually sending them to New York and Massachusetts into foster care homes and group homes. So the executive order that Trump signed on Wednesday stopped the separation of family. However, it didn't do anything to rectify the 2,342 children that had been separated. It simply said that they weren't going to keep separating children from their families. So while the administration will continue prosecuting crimes of what they call improper entry, the administration will, quote unquote, maintain family unity, including by detaining alien families together where appropriate and consistent with law and available resources. So instead of separating them, they're now detaining them together. So it really is just like, I guess, if you would like to call that better, I don't think it's better, because you're still technically like incarcerating children. And it's just, some people are saying that this was a good thing to see that pressure on the president caused him to change. Ebony, do you think that it was pressure? Because if you saw on social media, Nicki Minaj talked about how she was an undocumented person, French Montana, even DJ Khaled, they all talked about D.L. Hughley. Everyone was talking about how this was terrible, we need to do something about it, and then politicians started getting involved. I think they raised millions of dollars on a Facebook campaign. So do you think that all that really caused Trump to change his mind? Or do you think that this was all just intentional and he was going to stop it anyway, just so that he could still be able to do horrible things and say, well, at least it's not as bad as what we were doing a couple of days ago?
Well, okay, so actually, before I answer that question, some things that have been a little bit confusing to me, and I'm not sure how much you know specifically about this, but one thing that Trump and, I mean, his administration and, like, people that he just constantly allows to talk out loud for him, which are just as idiotic, have been saying that this was something that came from the Obama administration and that Trump actually is, like, now putting an end to it. And that's what they have been kind of, like, settling on. So I've read things that have suggested that, you know, yes, the Obama administration deported a lot of people, right? But that the separation of families was not something that was specifically, like, enforced. And I think that, well, first, I mean...
it was on the books, I think, since, like, Bush. And so, yes, they're right. And, you know, I love Obama, but one of the things that I've always hated about the Obama administration was the way that they handled immigration. And so people are right. Like, Obama definitely deported a lot of families, but no president actually separated families.
Yeah. And so, okay, so now to answer your question. So, yes, I do think that Trump probably at some point was going to put an end to this because I think ultimately it was a fear tactic, right? So it's like, well, I think that a lot of people are immigrating here with their children, obviously, for better lived experience, right? And so if you're bringing your child here for a better life, what better way to deter you from bringing your child here than to separate you from them?
Yeah.
And I mean, I'm sure that this is something that's being televised probably everywhere, probably around the world, you know? So word spreads, I'm sure. And like you were saying, like, some parents are being detained and then some parents are being deported. So if you're deporting folks back to their country of origin without their children, they're gonna be talking about it. People are gonna know this. And so I think that that's the goal, right? It's like, you know, detaining folks, deportation. If the administration viewed those things as things that wasn't necessarily deterring future immigration, I think that they found a way to you know, scare people into not coming, especially now holding on to kids.
Yeah.
Like, how can you just... I'm really trying to wrap my head around, like, how you deport someone to an entirely different country and keep their child.
Yep.
Like, that is very black and white kidnapping. Like, how...
No,
I don't...
it is.
So, yeah, I mean, I think that if Trump were actually concerned about whether or not this was wrong and, like, you know, truly felt like, oh, this, you know, this is wrong, I feel guilty about this, or this isn't right, blah, 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 let me fix this, it wouldn't have been done in the first place.
Yeah.
Like, I think that, you know, this is a strategy, and it's kind of like he has, in many ways, I'm sure he has probably fans on both sides. You know, it's like, oh my gosh, like, now look at Trump, like, he's fixing it. He fixed it. You know, and then also perpetuating the notion that Obama did this too.
Yeah.
Takes the pressure off him, and, you know, like, his base, they just hold on to anything he says. So it's like I can't remember who it was that was being interviewed on CNN, but the newscaster was asking, like, so what is your opinion on this? And the first thing that he said was, well, I mean, the Obama administration. And it's like, literally her question was, what is your opinion on what your, like, the person whose office you occupy, like, you work for Trump, what do you think?
Yeah.
You know, and it's like they have no answers of their own, but they can deflect like nobody's business. Like, the deflection skills that this administration has are incredible. Like, I mean, it's like, let's take the pressure, regardless whether it's fake or not, it doesn't matter, because people believe it. So I can say all day, oh, it wasn't me. Obama did it, and my base doesn't like him as it is, so all I gotta do is stamp his name on anything. And then, oh, look at me, fixing it. I'm awesome.
Yeah.
You know? And it's like, no, like, and nobody is talking about these remaining kids. I mean, people, the news is, but people themselves, I don't think that there is a real awareness, or maybe people in denial that, like, this is something that the United States would do. But I mean, girl, I really.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Now, like,
my God.
I was having a conversation with someone, and like we have talked about in this podcast is I used to be a former Republican, and one of the biggest things about the Republican Party is immigration reform. And so I was just saying, like, yes, I believe I'm an immigrant. I came here illegally. I'm now a citizen. I do believe there's an immigration problem. One, in that the process is so complicated, it's too long, it doesn't make sense. Two, I don't think that we can just have open borders where, there is no way to process people and make sure that we're allowing people to have jobs and to make sure that they're coming into a situation that they can be successful. But I think if you are okay with families being separated, no matter what their immigration status, then you are not a good person. Yeah. And if that offends you, then I don't care, because that's like, you're a terrible person. Like, people who think that's okay are terrible. And I think that one of the things that is most highlighted by this is that these people are Central Americans. Central Americans tend to be darker hue. They are very brown immigrants, and so I think that were they white children, we would not be separating white children from. Yes, it wouldn't be. It wouldn't take like freaking Nicki Minaj to say something about how terrible it is. Like, people would just be like, no. And like, as offended as people are that dogs are in kennels in hot cars, I think people would be.
Oh my God, you bored your dog? That is so traumatizing.
Yeah.
Oh my God, what?
Yeah.
Like, shut the fuck up. Like,
so,
what? I can't.
Yeah.
I can't. Like, I just. And, I mean, I think that one thing that's really important to note, right? And, I mean, granted, I am no foreign policy expert at all, but really wrap your head around the fact that people are fleeing these countries, a lot of these countries, because of poor circumstances that previous U.S. presidents initiated. So if you think about like how toxic some of the circumstances are and like the socio-political environment that people are running away from, President Reagan, presidents in the 80s, the 90s, they are the reason that these countries are having these issues, because we meddle in their political affairs, we exploit them. Like, we are the exploiters. So stop trying to convince yourself that, I've heard people like, well, why does the United States need to be responsible for fixing things or for helping people for the poor conditions of their country? Because we helped to create them.
Yeah.
And so I'm not saying that Trump is necessarily fully implicated in that, or that he should fully be held accountable for the deeds of former presidents, but you should not be reproducing and perpetuating a lot of those ills. Like, so by punishing these folks in this way for fleeing, like, poverty-ridden countries, and a lot of times, or circumstances, and then a lot of times violence and stuff like that, like, I mean, I don't understand what our expectations are. Like, and so I think that it makes sense for us to. I don't think that we can help everybody, but I think that specifically when it comes to, like, say, like Mexico, right? Like, we could help Mexico's economy. We could, and we choose not to.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if you want to know why, I think that one of our professors actually asked the question. So Selma and I took a class on immigration a few years back, and one of the questions that the professor asks is like, well, why do you think that people immigrate from Mexico? Why do you think that so many people immigrate from Mexico? And then a lot of times the answer is, because it's close, the U.S. is close to Mexico. And she's like, well, why don't you see people running from Canada into the United States? Because they're not doing that. Canadians are not, crossing the border at alarming rates or anything. It is because of the conditions. It is because of the socioeconomic conditions.
Yeah.
They are not coming just because like their country is in perfect condition and the United States just seems like, oh, I don't know, maybe I just want to be. No, it is because they perceive the United States to be safer. And it's not like they think that they're going to come here and make millions.
Yeah.
Like, that's not the case. So, I don't know. I think that we just really need to reframe the way that we think about immigration. And perfectly fine if Republicans, if like, you know, immigration reform is like core to Republican values or whatever, but that does not mean that we have to be thinking about it and framing it in the way that we do.
Yeah.
Like, there is some restructuring that needs to happen. And, you know, if, like Selma was saying, you know, if it's like, okay, well, in addition to expediting or cleaning up the immigration process, you know, like the documented immigration process, we can also figure out ways to help Mexico, help, you know, certain Central American countries. We are not doing that entirely by choice.
Yeah, so we'll keep you guys posted on our In the Know section, because I'm sure that this is not the end of this. No. So moving on to our second terrible news of the week. So on just a couple of days ago, there was another shooting of an unarmed boy, Antoine Rose. And so this was in, I think, Pittsburgh, and a police officer who we now know had been sworn in that night. He said that he had been a police officer for several years. But
working in law enforcement, which could have been like security.
That's true. I think one of the places he worked at was the University of Pittsburgh.
So he was like a university, probably something. Police officer, I don't know.
Yeah. So he fatally shot a 17-year-old boy just seconds after he fled from a traffic stop late Tuesday in a confrontation partly captured on video from a nearby home.
I would not call that a confrontation.
No. A confrontation does not involve, like, if you're running away from someone, I don't see how that's a confrontation.
That is hella one-sided.
Yeah, and so Rose was shot 3 times. We won't know where until the autopsy's done.
Definitely in the back.
But if you look at the video, he's running away, and the only place he could be shot is in the back. Mm-hmm. And no shots were fired at the officers, and no weapon was found on Rose's body.
And this was daylight.
Yes, this was daylight. And it's just it's everything about this is terrible. And I think that, it's sad because we've, in our podcast, have talked about other police shootings and have said, like, once again, like, it's just the perception that these boys are threatening that cause a police officer's initial reaction to be to shoot at him.
And also, the perception also is that they're guilty. They're guilty without, being given or provided any sort of due process, which is part of their civil liberties, we claim.
Yeah.
So, I don't understand why police officers continue to feel so privileged and entitled to the role of judge, jury, and executioner. Mm-hmm. No. You are a police officer.
Yeah, you're just
a police. Yeah, you went to a police academy, and literally, this man, finished? You said an hour before.
Yeah, he was sworn in that night.
Like, how is this your first? So your first traffic stop.
I know.
You kill somebody.
I know. That's not like any other job. If you fucked up that first day,
you would be fired. He's on administrative leave.
Oh.
What in God's name? Like, I just really don't. I've been trying to wrap my head around this, and I am at my wit's end. Like,
because there's no way. We shouldn't. There's no.
I just don't understand what it means to be white in America. I don't understand it.
Well, we're going to talk about it a little bit.
Yeah, how do you? I don't understand the white lens. I don't understand, like, white eyesight, like the white perspective. Like, how do you look at a 17-year-old kid and think, oh yeah, I'm gonna end his life right now.
Yeah,
and that's it. Like, not a second thought. your first thought is to shoot.
Is to shoot. And not just once, 3 times.
Yeah, like, you're in no danger. No. I thought that was what the purpose of it was, right? Isn't that why Republicans are fighting so hard for gun control? Yeah. Because they need to be protected, right? Yeah. And so it's like, well, what is it that you need? I mean, between white women and white cops, everybody's so scared. What are you scared of? What are you afraid of?
Yeah.
What are you,
like,
good Lord.
It's just been a really tough week for people of color. And it just kind of highlights, you know, Ebony and I are people of color. Ebony is a black woman. I am a Latina woman. And these are things that impact us not only in a just regular, like, person. Anyone should give a shit about someone dying. But, like, you know, I'm sure, Ebony, you see your brother. You see your boyfriend, and I see my family, my cousins. I see me in the separation of families. It's like we see ourselves in these things. These could easily be us. They don't give a shit in that moment if you're getting a PhD. They don't give a shit in that moment if anything. They just see color and they see threat. And so that's why we felt like this episode is important, because we're going to kind of try to talk about whiteness, what it can do. And so that's going to be in our What's Being Slept On. And so to close this section of In the Know, what we wanted to do was just recognize Antoine Rose as a person. And so Ebony is going to read a poem that he wrote himself. And we're going to just read the poem and then close this section and transition to What's Being Slept On. So, Ebony.
Antoine Rose, May 16th, 2016. I am not what you think. I am confused and afraid. I wonder what path I will take. I hear that there's only 2 ways out. I see mothers bury their sons. I want my mom to never feel that pain. I am confused and afraid. I pretend all is fine. I feel like I'm suffocating. I touch nothing, so I believe all is fine. I worry that it isn't, though. I cry no more. I am confused and afraid. I understand people believe that I'm just a statistic. I say to them I'm different. I dream of life getting easier. I try my best to make my dream true. I hope that it does. I am confused and afraid.
So I strongly suggest that you wake the fuck up.
Okay, so now transitioning to our What's Being Slept On segment, where we will be discussing whiteness and interviewing a friend of mine from undergrad. We are going to start out first by kind of giving some context to what the concept of whiteness entails. And we extracted this kind of definition from the Teaching Tolerance website. And what they say is that reconciling the meaning of white culture can be complicated by the fact that being white has not always meant what it means now. Whiteness, like all racial categories, is a social construct. Its meaning is culturally and historically contextual. The physical characteristics we now associate with whiteness have been artificially linked to power and privilege for the purpose of maintaining an unjust social hierarchy. So again, just to give some context to the topic of discussion, which is whiteness, before we kind of dive into this interview with Tonya. So Tonya, before we get started, if you could give us a little bit of background about what you do and kind of what you're pursuing now and like what your work entails.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Selma and Ebony, for having me on the podcast about whiteness.
Thank you for agreeing to come on.
Yeah. Yeah, no problem. So a little bit of background about what I do. I'm a PhD candidate at UCLA in the School of Education Information Studies with a concentration in race and ethnicity. And I also work in the academic advancement program with first-gen low-income students of color and helping them basically pursue PhD and their research interests, which is the program I was formerly in. So that's sort of like what I do for work, and then my research looks at undergraduate white women and how they understand race and racism and how the environments that they participate in on the college campus reinforce whiteness, and how this all sort of in turn supports the upholding of white supremacy on historically white campuses.
Okay. What motivated this shift toward a focus on whiteness?
Yeah, so I guess thinking about my educational trajectory and my experiences, I think I've been really thankful that I've been in spaces where I've had many moments to critically self-reflect on what it means for me to be a white woman and understand myself as a racial being. And so I think when I started my doctoral program, I was in my fourth iteration of my racial autobiography, white racial autobiography. Mm-hmm. And I think it was then that I was like, if I want to be doing racial justice work, the place where it felt most meaningful and important to do this is with other white folks, white women specifically. Mm-hmm. So I think it was really rereading every racial autobiography I've written from undergrad up until now this doc program that really caused that shift for me. And just recognizing that this work is also important. Considering my positionality, this is where I want to be having an impact on racial justice.
Right. And so would you agree, because this is definitely not my area of expertise, but given, my background in, studying race and stuff like that, I would say that this is kind of a new area of focus and a really under-researched area. Would you agree with that?
Yes and no.
Okay.
So I feel yes, in the sense that critical whiteness studies as a field, as a journal, as a discipline, as conversations we're seeing on social media, etc., does have, you're saying, this heightened notoriety, or not notoriety, but popularity that we hadn't seen before. Mm-hmm. But I think when I look at the critical whiteness scholars who I really learn from and cite and think about whiteness with, mm-hmm. they always talk about Du Bois and mm-hmm. Souls of White Folk, mm-hmm. and Baldwin, and his essay White Man's Guilt. And so those are pieces that were coming out in 1920 and 1960 where basically whiteness has been discussed. Mm-hmm. It just wasn't necessarily called whiteness mm-hmm. studies the way I think it is now.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
And I would say the same, when I think of my work on whiteness with white women of color have been calling out white women and how they uphold white racism in their work since Sojourner Truth. You know what I mean? So
right.
It's been there. It just hasn't been perhaps named the way we name it now.
Right.
So to add to this, I feel part of really wrapping oneself around their own whiteness is relishing and sitting in the discomfort of being the problem. Part of that's part of one's existence in whiteness, and any unmarked category is really George Yancey, mm-hmm. he writes on critical whiteness. His book is literally, the question is, how does it feel to be a white problem? Mm-hmm. And I think he's reversing this question, right? For whites to really grapple with that, because if not, then that's how we keep the category unmarked.
Right. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know, depending on who you talk to in the whiteness work, there's people that, there's a really famous quote by a neo-abolitionist or a white racial abolitionist who says, whiteness is nothing but oppressive and false. And so what does it mean for us to, really understand that and recognize that there's nothing about whiteness that we should continue to invest in or embrace as part of our identity.
Okay. So I know we've kind of already been talking for a little bit, but And we started this conversation by giving you a definition that we found on a website. But for you as a white person and as someone who is doing whiteness studies, how would you define whiteness in what you've learned and in what you've experienced for people who may not be in academic spaces and may not read a lot of these people that we're talking about? How would you kind of explain what whiteness is to someone who hadn't really encountered a lot of just like these theorists?
Right. Yeah, I think to me, it's a way of being that makes one. It's a way of being normal, and it's something that is constantly redefined. So it works in favor of white people, and it provides benefits for us in the structures that we're in the schools that we're in the way that we just sort of operate in the world. It's a way of being that constantly privileges us, which in turn causes people of color to lose in various ways, economically, socially, all of these ways in which privilege plays itself out.
So would you say whiteness is more than a racial category? Because I know sometimes we talk about, a racial category is white, black, but does whiteness entail more than just being white as your racial category? Because you seem to be talking about like a way of living, a way of like ideas that we hold. Is whiteness beyond just white as your race?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think when I think about whiteness, I actually think of it more closely related to white supremacy, like being an ideology.
Okay.
And that it allows one group to have dominance, which is white, over folks of color. So, yeah, I think white identity and whiteness are different.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so I guess with that, since you kind of took us there, I think that I've been seeing, mostly on social media, an increased sensitivity to the concept white supremacy. And so if you could kind of explain to us what white supremacy is, and then also how an individual, or a white individual in particular, doesn't necessarily themselves have to believe that white people are supreme in order for white supremacy to continue to prevail.
Yeah, okay, so I think that white supremacy is an ideology, right? It's a deep-rooted belief system that controls our laws, our schools, everything that we've sort of been talking about, and it allows whites to be dominant over folks of color. And so I think that what's really interesting, so this actually connects to my research, because I'm looking at historically white institutions. And so when I say that, what I'm saying is, while the institutions that I study used to be made up by 50% or more white students, they no longer are. They no longer are necessarily 50% white, but whiteness and white supremacy is still rampant in that space, based on the curriculum, right? Like the processes, the everyday processes in those spaces, the actual land itself. So white supremacy doesn't have to. It's the reason why ideology and white supremacy is powerful is because it doesn't even need white actors. Right. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah. And I think that one thing for people that's difficult for folks to wrap their head around, particularly when a lot of these concepts, I think, emerge from academic spaces, is that when we use words like ideology, it kind of suggests or insinuates that there are individuals themselves that possess these ideas. I think that one thing that I think should be emphasized, and I think is emphasized in academic spaces, but that doesn't always translate, is that, like you said, there doesn't need to be actual white actors that are reproducing, you know, these ideas. All the white people themselves could wake up tomorrow and, you know, have this like newfound kind of respect and increased tolerance and kind of, you know, notions of racial equality and all of that, and white supremacy could still exist, you know. And so I don't know how we could make that something that translates better to a wider audience, because I think that talking about whiteness and even white supremacy, like, these things have gotten just, I mean, these are hashtags. Like, it's like, you know, it's so watered down. It's like, how do we make sure that folks understand and can like really grab onto this? Yeah, I don't know.
I don't know. One thing that comes to mind as you say that is like internalized racism. And so when we when we see in media or white folks talking about how folks of color injure and harm other communities of color, and that is racism, like, when we couch that or understand that as a larger manifestation of white supremacy, this racial hierarchy at play, we can better explain how that is that is what white supremacy wants us to do, right? To continue to divide.
Right.
And so I think, like, thinking about taking it out of this context of academia and how we're defining it, like, it has these, like, day-to-day real costs to people when we can understand the way it's constantly at play in our everyday sort of life.
So you've been talking about, and we've been talking about in our podcast in previous episodes, just about, you know, racial injustice and kind of unequal experiences of people of color in terms of mass incarceration. We talked about maternal mortality. We've talked about stress and mental health. But how can whiteness be used to address this, the unjust social hierarchy? So what, not only like white people, like what can white people do, but how can whiteness, like, does it have to be undone in order for, I know in your study you talk about these institutions and how they used to be majority white and now they're not. Like, how can we fix like the system that's broken? Because sometimes we like to give some positivity to our listeners so they can kind of think like, okay, well, what can actually be done? Because it's sometimes it seems overwhelming to think that there's this system at play that doesn't need people, that just keeps existing. So how can we change it?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing to do is to continue to name it. So, like, going back to Ebony's concern about, like, this turn to it and how it's unmarked, like, part of what we need to do is be able to start naming what it actually looks like in practice as a way to undo it, right? Like, if it's so normative and it's so invisible, then a big part of this is, what does this look like? How is this operating at the university, for instance, or in this interaction? How is whiteness being used? And I think that's part of what will help undo its hold. But ultimately, I think it needs to be abolished.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, I was thinking, you know, like, actually, someone, when you were asking that question, I was like, yeah, you know, I could see white folks feeling like, you know, how, if white supremacy exists and it transcends actual people, you know, does that just mean that, like, as a white person, like, I'm just going to be problematic forever and there's nothing I can do about it? And I was thinking that maybe then people could be unmotivated, you know, or feel kind of paralyzed, like, well, then why am I doing, like, for folks that are actually, you know, out there, like you're saying, Tonya, like, naming it, maybe doing some of the work that you're doing, or, you know, a part of these minority movements and things like that. For those folks, like, this is still important work, but it's like, okay, well, is it fruitless if what they're doing actually isn't going to change anything? But I actually think that your answer, Tonya, should inspire hope in some of those folks, because it's like, all right, well, I myself am not necessarily the problem. Like, this white supremacy predates me, whiteness predates me, and it'll be here long after, probably, sadly. But, you know, it's like I think that and we have a lot of white listeners, and I think that there should be, I think some, I don't know, I think folks should find solace or something, comfort maybe, in the fact that you can do the work, and that the work could produce some incremental change. Maybe it might not dismantle whiteness, but it shouldn't be like a motivation to, like, you know, oh well, it's bigger than me, I can't do anything about it.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think that's debilitating, right? And I think that's what white racial dominance wants us to do.
Yeah.
It wants us to think that it's so big that it can't be, like, pulled apart.
Yeah.
And so I think part of it is, like, recognizing one's own responsibility in working towards undoing it. And I think it's the Combahee River Collective that says, like, white women, like, undoing racism with white women is work for white women to do. And so, and that's one example of many folks of color who have said, if you want to have an impact or do racial justice work, then do it in the white community, right? And so I think that's all the impetus that at least I need in my work, to say there's plenty. Unfortunately, I can have a job out of this because there's not much work that needs to be done.
Yeah.
So the more people doing it, the better.
Yeah. So can we for a second, like, we have some other questions for you, but can we for a second talk about white women and, like, what is going on? Because, I mean, I know that you have social media, like, I'm sure you've been seeing it, and, like, you know, I've been seeing like, for instance, the woman, I can't remember her name, but the woman that did, like, the parody, or she didn't call it a parody, but the remix or whatever you want to call it of the Childish Gambino "This Is America" video, and there were a ton of white women that were, on the one hand, women saying, like, oh, I'm so embarrassed, like, you know, this is one of the first times that I've, like, truly felt embarrassed as a white woman, like, you know, and then there were other women that were like, why are you posting this? Why are you even, you know, like, you shouldn't even be giving her video the light of day, and that, you know, saying that by acknowledging it, it's also perpetuating the problem by giving her any kind of, you know, attention. But and similarly, you know, for, like, last month, all these white women in different spaces calling the police on black folks kind of just existing, you know, but I just don't understand the logic that, like, by talking about it, that is perpetuating race issues, not the fact that it was done in the first place.
Yeah.
I know. I don't know. I mean, not that I expect for you to answer for all white women, obviously. And I know that you obviously, you don't think that way. And so it's like, how can I ask you to unpack? I mean, I guess maybe from a research-oriented perspective. I don't know.
No, I think definitely, I have thoughts.
Okay.
I do have thoughts.
Yes.
And I think one is, with the critique of why are we talking about it, once again, whiteness doing well at work, right? Like, that's what the discursive moves of whiteness are. Why do you make
You better say discursive.
Right? It's like, that's what we do as white people to prevent this from being further discussed. It's moving away from whiteness to, like, distract the actual problem to be interrogated. I think that's what that is.
Yeah.
And I think the white women calling the cops, I actually talk about this in my work, in that, like, basically this is white fear. This is white women's fear. And I should say, like, false sense of fear, right? A false sense of fear that causes actual harm to people of color, as we've been seeing with police violence and killings, right? One of my mentors uses Emmett Till as an example of this. And she says, like, this white woman literally called rape, and on her deathbed, you know, said that it wasn't, and this 14-year-old black boy was beat to death for her white fear.
Right.
So, like, this gets, like, deep into, like, psychoanalytics, right? And I think if we think about, like, our history and the way white women have been taught to see themselves as racially innocent, this is just like a extension of what we've been seeing, this damsel in distress, white woman narrative of racial purity and innocence. And I think it's a perceived sense of fear. So that's why I don't feel like it's real. And I think Robin DiAngelo in White Fragility talks about this, right? Like, white people don't have racial stress in their lives. They haven't, like, grown up to have to talk about race, to think about race. And so when they're in these instances, it becomes this perceived sense of actual fear, which to them seems real, even though it's really not.
Right. Okay. Yeah, because I mean, I've been struggling so much with that. And I think that one thing that, we were talking about this before, and one thing that Selma brought up is, you know, how white womanhood, and kind of whiteness more broadly, has become a real topic for discussion following the election. And that, you know, it's particularly, like, you know, middle America and what it means to be white and poor, and, you know, how we have, because of the assumptions that we've made about whiteness and its association with privilege, that these kind of poor white folks had just fell through the cracks, you know. And I get that argument, I do. But then on the flip side, it's like, okay, well, what about all the college educated women that are white and voted for Trump? You know, and so if I don't know, it's like I think that I mean, and this kind of goes more into a conversation on white feminism. I think that we have been led to believe, particularly like people that study gender, have been led to believe that being a woman, being a gender minority, gives white women claim to oppression, and then kind of drew on that idea to assume that they would, and then that they would then obviously vote for Hillary Clinton, and that they would see the flaws in someone like Trump, who has all these, you know, sexual assault allegations and stuff like that. This is what the wheels have been turning for like almost a year now, and I've just really been trying to figure it out.
No, I think about this all the time. So it's nice to hear y'all thinking about these things too. And I think that, like, without creating that dichotomy, because I think about this in my work, and I think that there is, like, literature and studies and people talking about, well, if we have one type of oppression, we're more likely, or if we're from one, like, disadvantaged group, we can possibly better understand oppression in general for other groups, right? I think that's, like, something that people try to talk about. Right. But then, interestingly, I write a lot about, like, there's this one really powerful quote that a whiteness scholar says, basically, white women don't call the shots, but they're quick to pull the trigger. It's like, what does it mean when you have whiteness? Like, if you only have whiteness and you're a woman, then are you holding on to your whiteness and protecting it with all that you can because that's all you have? So it's almost like it gets at this larger, like, I think that, like, complex social hierarchy that we have, that is why I feel like I'm doing my study. It's like we don't know enough about this multi-layered, complex, one up, one down identity, being white and being woman.
Yeah, that is really deep. Like, I'm really, like, kind of stumped. So, I mean, because then that opens us up for a conversation about intersectionality, right? And so, is that what it really means? So, as a person that is privileged in one hierarchy, and I mean, I guess marginalized on another, you know, are white women, I guess what you're saying is, are white women more protective of their whiteness than white men, because white men ultimately still have manhood to fall back on? Okay.
Exactly.
Dang, that's
deep. So we have to think about these groups relationally to understand how power is at play and how white women continue to be protected through their whiteness.
Right. Okay, I think that's all of my questions.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Well, Tonya, I think we're going to wrap up there. Thank you so much for agreeing to talk with us. I mean, I feel like I've learned a lot.
Yeah, no, me too.
Yeah, and I hope that the folks out there will appreciate this conversation. Regardless of whether they do or not, know that we do.
Thank you. Thank you both again so much for having me.
Yeah.
And I just really appreciate us being able to have the conversation, the questions.
Yeah.
I think it's important that we continue these conversations.
Yes.
Definitely. We may have you on again in the future as we continue to map out future topics. So stay tuned.
Of course. Just let me know.
All right. Thanks, girl.
Okay.
Bye.
No problem.